First of all, thank you so much for coming and doing this interview with me. I really do appreciate it, and I'm really excited to see your inside. How are you feeling today?
Great. So I finished my class.
Of course, that makes a lot of sense after your class, a bit of relaxing and then going home. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, are you ready to start?
Yes.
I have put down a paper. If you do want to note anything down, if you have any questions that you want to keep for the end, you're more than welcome to. So first of all, how do you define management, and how has the definition evolved over your career?
So this is a very interesting question because I don't think the actual definition has changed. Change management is all about managing change. There is an event that is happening and you have to respond to it, and you need to consider ways through which you can respond to it. But what has changed over the years, especially because sociopolitical events, demographic changes, you have environmental, the climate crisis happening, you have all these macro level events creating a lot of uncertainty, turbulence, and crisis. And you see now a lot of authors talking about polycrisis, multiple crises happening in parallel at the same time. So I think what's happening now is that whereas maybe in the past things were relatively more stable and you went through your organizational life and maybe there was a change that needed to be implemented and another change down the line. And now the rate of things happening, there are multiple changes that need to be constantly happening, it seems almost. That the organizations need to keep on trying to change all the time, to respond to whatever is happening out there.
So you're saying it's more rapid than it was
More
in the
rapid
past.
and more frequent, to the extent that it's not something that you can think of it as a standalone. Like I'm doing I don't know, have a business and then there's a change. I need to manage this change. I think it's incorporated. Change is happening all the time, and then you need to create organizations that are able to navigate, constantly navigate
They have to
through
have
these
that.
scenarios.
Yeah.
Yes. It's not something that, I am in a certain way. There's a change happening. I need to change the way I am as a one off.
Mhm.
It's coming up with organizations that are in their core able to change all the time.
That makes sense. Thank you for that answer. For our next question, could you describe a specific organizational change that you have led? Successful or unsuccessful, doesn't really matter. And what key lessons you took from that experience?
So that was some years ago when I was part of a senior leadership team in another university. And I mean, we've been through universities in the UK have been having difficulties, financial difficulties for a long time now, but more pronounced in the last, 5 years, 10 years. Um, so there are changes happening all the time, but this was a major restructuring exercise. I was a head of department and in a business school, and the change was affecting the programs that we were delivering, and as a result, the staff, the academic faculty that was delivering the programs. And there was a decision to make redundant, or in a sense, um, pressure, if you like, senior lecturers, which we had different about 50 people. They had to reapply for the position, and that was a way to select which ones we wanted to keep for the future. On the rationale that they didn't quite either have the subject expertise that we were gonna need for the new courses we were designing, or they were not meeting either the teaching or the research kind of requirements in terms of contribution. Um, the interesting thing that I've learned is that change doesn't happen exactly as in the textbooks. And you have a lot of examples of very bad practice. So usually you come up with a rationale to say, okay, we need to adjust the courses, which means we need to create new products, and that means the staff will be affected. but it seemed that the exercise started from the other way around. Like, who do we want to let go as part of this exercise?
Okay.
So who do we, could do without?
Mm.
And that shouldn't be the way that.
Mm.
Of course, I wasn't the one deciding. It was a kind of person of authority. But it just shows you that you could have leaders that are not following the best practice in terms of transparency and fairness and openness and genuine kind of need for change. I mean, there was a need for change, but it just there's a different process that should
It
be
could have come
be
from a
followed.
different.
Yes, rather than start from that to say,
Mm.
and it was so. It was my first experience of being in a kind of a senior team, and I was presented with a handkerchief, a little how do you say
A tissue?
a tissue, and he was writing people's name on it. Who do you, Maria, da, 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 and then he threw it out. So So that's not the way to select
Yeah.
employees for redundancy. You don't go with your gut feeling. If you are genuine to say, look, we need to change the courses. Okay, let's create the courses. Let's say what type of specialism we need, and let's leave it at that. People can reapply. They can tell us about whether or not they are fitting the new requirements, and we can have a process to go about rather than having a pre-selected potential pool of people that we would like to push out through this process.
Of course, I completely understand where you're coming from. That just sounds like a wrong approach to take in a change management, especially when it's about people, because people they have lives, they all have a family, someone to support, maybe even themselves. Definitely, that does make sense. Thank you for your answer. So our next question is, what are some change management frameworks or models such as Cotter's 8-step model, ADKAR, or Levin's 3 steps that you have observed organizations using, and which of them do you find the most effective?
Yeah, so that's also a very good question. The truth is that when you are in a situation in an organization, there will be nobody that says, let's implement Kotter's, blah, 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 let's implement. No, and actually, these frameworks have come to exist because of someone observing practice and then conceptualizing what happens in practice into these different frameworks. But you never in practice hear the actual names. But I think out of all of them, the most visible experience that I had of the one of them was with Lewin's the three-stage process without being called as such. But in several change initiatives, especially in previous universities, what happens is because the change is so significant, they cannot just jump, close one day the system in the way they have been operating and switch next day. So, and it's a bizarre, it's like a zombie land, because they announced the change. Let's say in my previous institution, they announced, the restructuring from schools to colleges. There would be subject areas affected, redundancies, new requirements for research, for enterprise, for outputs, for income, for student experience, etc. So they make this announcement that there's going to be a new way of doing things, but the new way of doing things was not yet ready. So in the meantime, people were progressing as if nothing was happening. Bizarre. So catastrophe is coming. Nothing of what you do now is going to exist in 6 months. But because we don't have these new rules, policies in place, you will keep on working as you have, even though nothing will exist 6 months down the line because there's going to be a new reality. And I think it's that unfreeze, what's the second? Change and then freeze. See, it's that step that was, or I've noticed it a couple of times, especially in those big changes because you can't just go. You
Yeah.
need to continue with some maybe minor changes slowly, until everything is in place, and then you forget the past and you lock into the new system.
That is very insightful. I have seen that personally happen a lot of times too. When I think about change, I don't think about a lot of models that are lengthy in its process, but I'd rather think about unfreeze, change, and refreeze because it's the simplest way to observe a change in many organizations and kind of conceptualize it too. So I would definitely agree with you. I personally also like AdCard because I think from a humanitarian perspective, from personal, I can see that happen a lot. So, how do you see external factors such as regulations, market shifts, or technological advances affect the change management approaches you have observed in organizations?
Yeah, I think this links with the first question, this idea of macro level, poly crisis, things changing. Certainly, I think technology is bringing about huge change. And in some cases, what I'm noticing is that there are some businesses that just they can't cope. They're not ready for it. They can't forecast. They can't predict. They don't know how to act. Education is an example. And the takeoff of AI is the change. And you see, even HART, this institution, which is quite in alignment with looking at the kind of technological changes, we created the policy around students can use AI. Students are using AI so much, we don't know the assignments, we don't know how to do it. And you talk to other colleagues in other places, in other institutions, and the public sector is even slower there. There are some institutions that are even slower to pick up, learn, and think about how to. So yeah, I think especially technology is, you need skills. You need to, that's the difficult aspect with this aspect, the technological aspect. And if you cannot understand the technology, you cannot think about how to resolve it. It's a lack of resources, I think, in many organizations.
That makes sense. Do you think there is a bigger difference between private and public institutions?
I think public are always very slower, they're more bureaucratic. They take a lot of time they're like dinosaurs. They because they have all these hierarchies and the committees, and it has to go through a study. I mean, you can see it. You have a new vice chancellor in a public institution. They take 2 years to implement any change because they take at least a year and a half to review. In private organizations, things are more linear. Things are happening faster. But I think it's the lack of skills and their inability to find skills. In HART, for example, Agile, there is a person that is at the global level responsible for keeping us up to date with AI, and supporting the faculty, supporting the policy, supporting training development. You don't find this in other places. And similarly, in businesses with Brexit, for example. So many businesses struggled because they couldn't understand, have the expertise to make sense of all the new rules. Because you need someone that knows really the legislative environment, legislations, how they changed, processes to advise, and they don't have resources. They didn't have resources to tap into that. So that's what I think is the difficult part with this type of big changes.
That's really interesting to hear. I didn't know that Holt had a global person that takes care of AI management and the policies that change. I know that it's a big company and it has a lot of departments, but I didn't know it had a specific department. And I do agree that bureaucracy, I think, is also one of the biggest issues in why change occurs so slowly. So, what are the most significant challenges you typically encounter when implementing organizational change, and how do you address them?
For me, as a head of department, when I was working in that institution, it's getting people on board. That was the biggest thing for me. And it's a very tricky aspect because when you are a line manager, you have two hats on. You are manager, part of management that is coming up with this idea for change, and then you're also a colleague. Your team members, especially in academia, you don't have these hierarchies there because eventually somebody else is going to be the head of department. It's a role that you do on rotation. So it's a difficult dynamic, and it's difficult to convince them. First of all, even if you are 100% sure that this is the direction to take, and sometimes it's not, Because sometimes it's not a collective decision, sometimes it's somebody higher up deciding. So you might not agree yourself with this, and yet you need to sell it to others. Or even if you're 100% in agreement, then because this change is going to affect individuals, not everybody is going to want it. And you cannot really talk about the benefits for the organization when somebody, for example, is at risk of redundancy. So it's that interpersonal aspect, if you like.
Yeah, it's like standing at crossroads.
Yes.
Picking it's like picking family and friendship over benefits
But
of
for
the
the benefit for the
organization.
company, yeah, for the organization. Yeah.
I can imagine that that's a really hard position. Balancing it is very important, and from what I heard, I think you definitely did.
Yeah. Yeah.
How should organizations identify and manage sources of employee resistance during change initiatives?
So the best way to eliminate or minimize, you cannot eliminate because people have opinions, but you can certainly minimize is through voice mechanisms. Communication, open communication, transparent communication, sharing of the plans, and consultation, but honest consultation, not to say, oh, we're consulting, and then nothing happens because people will know. And also, many companies, organizations have trade unions in place. Trade unions can go on strike. You need to treat them with respect. You need to include them, bring them to the table, talk about the plans, give them time, respond, incorporate this. You need them on board because if the worst thing that can happen is you come up with an idea, many universities have this problem. We have a problem with money, we need to close some disciplines, we're going to make people redundant. Okay. But you don't talk about the alternatives to doing that. You don't invite feedback. You don't bring the trade union to the table to share ideas because they also want to keep their jobs. They want the university to do well. And maybe, but it's not, it's a leadership. It's a leadership weakness. The fact that you have leaders deciding at the top level without bringing others as part of the decision making process. Obviously, leaders will need to make some decisions, but there's a difference in between of at least trying to bring people on board to openly talk about situations and problems and solutions, and then versus another scenario where you close the door and sometimes you don't even involve middle managers, so people just don't know when you just announce. So it's that aspect for me, the voice, the feedback, the communication, the transparency, and the engagement with key employees that you have, employee groups, maybe your managers or the trade union to bring them on board.
Yeah, that makes definitely sense. I think it's also about being attentive and not just listening, but implementing change when it's demanded and you can see that it might have benefits. Thank you for that answer as well. And lastly, what skills do you believe are essential for an effective change leader today?
I think the biggest skill is that they need to be a human with consideration, with emotions, with I think people are oftentimes forgetting the human aspect of managing change because they focus on the difficulties on solving the business problem. And we had a very interesting debate in class actually the other day about the role of HR. It could be considered as the role of leaders in a big kind of scenario crisis situation where you have to implement change. Where is your loyalty? Is it towards the company to help it survive? Or is it towards the employees to help them and find a way to minimize the impact and support them? I think it's obviously you need the organization,
Yeah.
and it's a challenging one. You have to make some tough choices, but it's I think it's finding that balance so that you don't hurt the individuals through the way you do it. And it's your reputation and it's your competitive advantage tomorrow. And it's your ability to deal with more changes down the line. Because these are not isolated incidents. If you have a job long enough for in an organization, you will see multiple changes happening. So there's no benefit in you really being nasty to your employees just to save the business, because the remaining employees are going to hate it, they're going to want to go, you're going to lose your reputation, productivity, motivation, engagement, all of these things go down. There are some very difficult changes that you can make, and yet have the majority of the people on board and support the majority as much as you can.
That is definitely true. I've been thinking about it, and I feel emotional intelligence is such a factor that gets lost so fast, even though it's one of the most important. Like you said, it's not about just business. It's about you're managing humans, and you also need to make sure that they are okay. It's about making sure that they can live their life too. It's not only about numbers and finances.
Yeah.
It's
And unfortunately, you see many bad examples. Even in class, there was this executive on the news that fired a huge number of employees through Zoom. If you're on this call, sorry to tell you, you're the unlucky ones. You can find it on YouTube and see it.
oh wow.
What kind of a management practice is this? To let people know they're losing their job over. Yes, you can do it. Maybe the law allows you. I don't know which context it was, but it's certainly not something that you would like to be remembered for.
Definitely not. I think we have had that conversation before in class.
Yes. You
In
remember the
summer,
video?
yes, I do.
Yes.
That was definitely horrible, and I do not know which HR practices that passed through. And
Maybe there wasn't any.
maybe there wasn't any. But thank you so much for
Thank
giving me
you.
your
I hope it was
answers and your
useful.
insights. It definitely was. It was really interesting on a personal level. Thank you.
Thank you.